I've built a little bit of time at the end, hopefully, for questions, but I'll also hang on the call as well. So if anybody has any like specific questions at the end or anything, we can do that. But as we go along, I'm happy to just like dip in and out of questions in the chat. It would be really nice actually if you can use the chat function between you, because I'll ask you quite a lot of questions. And we've got some case studies at the end, like 2 case studies at the end for you to think about. It's good to like have chats within the chat group as well. I'm going to share my screen, just a second. I've only got one screen today, which is confusing me. Usually have 2. I'm like, here we go. Slideshow from beginning. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, wicked. Oh, now I've shared my screen, I can't see the chat. Just a second, just get the chat back up. Here we go. The wonders of technology. You'd think that we'd all be used to this by now, but apparently some of us are not. So yes, welcome. My name's Antonia. To give you a little bit of background about me, my pronouns she, they. I use them quite interchangeably, so whatever you want to use is fine. I work at Come Play With Me, which is a record label based in Leeds. We're also a community interest company, so we specifically work with queer people across the Leeds region. We work a lot with people of marginalised genders, women, people of colour, loads of different people basically, to help people get jobs in music, but also record, write, produce their own music. We do compilation albums, and we've got a singles club that we put out. We run a magazine, we're starting a podcast. There's loads of stuff going on, but it's really fun and really interesting. We get to work with a lot of different people from across Leeds, mainly in kind of like education settings and stuff like that. So that's really fun. I'm also club secretary at Stonewall FC, which is a football club in London. I think it's the oldest LGBT football club in London. And being club secretary is really fun, but also it's mostly paying fines because people get yellow cards a lot. So yeah, sounds fun, but is actually a lot of admin. I also play for their football team, so I've got football tonight actually, which is exciting. Hoping to score at least 1 goal, but it's just 5-a-side, so we'll see. So yeah, that's me. I do a lot of these sort of like workshops for different people, Stonewall, Gallup, like lots of organisations that are LGBT specific, going into kind of different organizations talking about HR policy and all that kind of stuff, but then I also get to do cool things with like tour production companies and people like you, so makes it all worthwhile. If you want to just pop in the chat box to introduce yourselves, that'd be really great. If you want to put your pronouns in there as well, that would be wonderful. And just let me know kind of like what you want to get out of the session, and hopefully the things that you want to get out of it will be kind of seen to by the end of the session. But it'd be really nice to see kind of where people are from and what it is that you're looking for from this hour. This is where I can see you all typing. Hi, Becky. Thank you. First in. This is always where I think no one's doing anything, and then I get loads of things at once with everybody's names and what they're doing and where they are. It'd be nice to know where you are in the world as well. If you're in London or if you're outside of London, that would be great. If it's snowing. Cool. So lots of people working in marketing, thinking about how you can be more inclusive. Yeah, people helping different communities. Hello, Ross in Bradford. Cool, amazing. County councils, so many different people in this room, wicked. From the Roundhouse. Brilliant, excellent. I feel like a lot of these organisations that you're talking about are people that I always send people to, so great. Phoebe, come to football. So just to run through like today's session, we've literally got an hour. So I'm going to go through a little bit of terminology, talk about pronouns and identity. We're going to talk a tiny bit about trans history and the fact that trans people have always existed, a little bit about trans experiences. So generally across kind of like society and in work and like how trans people experience the world. And then we'll go through a little bit of action planning. The action planning will include case studies, so we can talk through 2 specific case studies and think about how we can support those people, and hopefully that will help you with the action planning that we do at the end as well. I've just seen that Jenny Hoy is in the room, and I remember, Jenny, you sent me a 4-track recorder once.
Yeah, I did, yeah.
A long
and some
time.
tea bags as well, so that's a bit
tea bags, yeah, I remember this. Wonderful. I have to say I recorded 3 songs on that, one of which was a cover of a Delta 5 songs that went on a compilation, and I've never played in a band since, so
oh, sorry.
Not your fault. I think it's my lack of ability rather than the recorder itself. So
nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you. Today's Trans Day of Visibility. It's the 31st of March every year. It started in 2008, and it's basically a day that is dedicated to celebrating trans history, trans people, raising awareness of this discrimination faced by trans people around the world, but also a huge celebration of people's contributions to society. Like I said earlier, like trans people have always existed. They've always been around, not necessarily as much in the press as they are at the moment. I think if you live in London and you've seen the front cover of today's Metro, you will see kind of why. If you haven't seen it, just Google it if you want to. It's quite triggering, but yeah, you'll see why it's kind of important to have days like this and to think about the positives around the trans community and how we actually exist and live in the world and contribute to it in a nice way. 1% of the population is trans, and it's not as big and scary as the press sometimes make out, particularly at the moment. To kick us off, I wanted to start with a little bit of terminology. I feel like some people might know some of the words that we go through in the next couple of slides. Some of the words might be new to you, but feel free to just pop any questions or thoughts or anything in the chat. It'd be nice to have like a bit of a talk around these things. Can anybody start us off by putting any of the definitions to these words in the chat group at all? I'll go through them one by one as well. Someone's just asked if you get copies of the slides. I will sort out some copies of some of these slides. Yes. Trans, your gender identity is different to the one that you're assigned at birth. Yes, basically. Let me pop the thing up. So it's an umbrella term. It's used generally to describe people whose gender isn't the same as or doesn't sit comfortably with the sex that they're assigned at birth. So it includes non-binary people, which is the next section. So non-binary is another umbrella term, but it's for a person who doesn't identify as only male or female, might identify as both, might identify as neither, but those things are kind of umbrellaed together under the trans umbrella, so it's basically people whose gender isn't the same as the one that they were assigned at birth. Pronouns, anybody? I see some people have got their pronouns in their name. on Zoom already. What we say instead of saying someone's name over and over again. Yes, exactly. Basically just words that we refer to people's gender in conversation. So he, she, they. A lot of the time you'll use they if you don't know someone's pronouns or you've never met them, or like out of context, you don't know anything about them. Yep. And then transitioning, I've just put that one up there. But basically transitioning is the steps that a trans person might take to live in the gender with which they identify. So that transition might involve different things. It might be medical, it might be social. A lot of the time, it's not necessarily a medical intervention that people look for or do when they're transitioning. And transitioning can be a really long process for people. A lot of the time it's quite a fluid thing. So it will start with thinking about, am I trans? How do I want to identify? Like what kind of pronouns do I want to use? And those things might change as well, right? So you might have someone that starts using their, them pronouns, but then they might start to use she pronouns or he pronouns. So like those things might change as people kind of move along with their life and in different kind of situations. It's not necessarily just medical intervention that people look for when they are trans or when they're transitioning. It could be just sort of like dressing differently or changing your gender on your passport or your driving license, etc. Using different pronouns in different situations and stuff like that. And I think when you work with young people in particular, which I feel like a lot of people will do in this room, it's important, I think, to think about the way that people use pronouns in different situations, in different settings. So for example, you know, a young person might use their them pronouns when they're at college or school or even university, but might not use those pronouns when they're at home with their parents or in different sort of like work situations and things like that. So I think it's important to think about kind of how people's transition might take a long time, and it's not just like a quick, oh, I'm changing from one thing to another. It's a very fluid and quite long process for a lot of people. We've got a few more words on the next slide. I'm going to pop them all up because I've messed up my thing. But gender identity is basically a person's sense of their own gender. So whether that's like male, female, non-binary, it might not correspond to the sex assigned at birth. It might do. So everyone has a gender identity, regardless of whether or not you're trans. A lot of the time, you know, people will use their kind of different pronouns or whatever, that it might be different and not correspond to the sex assigned at birth. It doesn't necessarily, like having a gender identity doesn't mean you're trans. Like cis and heterosexual people have gender identities and sexual orientations. Queer is often a term that's used by people that want to reject specific kind of labels of things like romantic orientation, sexual orientation, and gender identity. I've left it in here because it's a lot of the time people will think about queer as a sexual orientation, but sometimes people will use it to describe their gender identity as well. For me personally, I use queer to kind of cover my romantic orientation, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Like it covers everything for me. So it was used as a slur quite a lot in kind of like the 80s, 90s, particularly for gay men. So it can be quite triggering for some people, but it is something that has kind of been reclaimed by particularly young people recently, and kind of is something that you can use as a kind of catch-all for, yeah, being not straight, basically. And that's how I kind of use it. So it's a good example, personal example from me there. And cisgender. What's interesting about the word cisgender is that like 4 or 5 years ago when I started doing sessions like this, we kind of didn't, like there was a lot of people that wouldn't have heard that word or haven't heard that word, don't know what it means. But now when I do these sessions, a lot of people know already what cisgender actually means. And it's basically someone whose gender identity is the same as the sex that they were assigned at birth. Can anybody tell me in the chat or just unmuting your mic why it's important that we have a word like cisgender?
I'll go. I'll say, yeah, so the reason why it's important is because we don't want normally there's this sort of idea that cis is normal, and then, you know, everything else is a bit different or other. So it's to sort of level the playing field and make sure that everyone's identity is, you know, considered equal and no one is different or othered.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect answer. I think it's very important to have a word for lots of different identities. And like you said, so we're not othering, like what's seen as, in quotes, normal is to be heterosexual and cisgender, when actually there are lots of different identities that exist. You know, someone doesn't necessarily, like someone heterosexual isn't necessarily cisgender, someone transgender isn't necessarily queer, all those kind of things. Like everyone has these bits of their identity, and it just means that there's a word for it, so we might as well use it, because then we're not othering the group of more marginalized or more oppressed people. So yeah, thank you for that. Gender recognition certificate, and I'll touch on this a little bit more when we talk about like trans history, but the gender recognition certificate basically enables trans people to be legally recognized in their affirmed gender, and to be issued with a certificate, a new birth certificate. So not all trans people will apply for a gender recognition certificate. You do currently have to be over 18 to do that and to get that. There are lots of organisations that are lobbying towards it being over 16, reducing that to 16. There is a lot of like bureaucracy around the gender recognition certificate, and like how you can get it. It takes a long time, etc. And like I said, we'll touch on this in a little bit. But I think it's important, particularly when you're working maybe with young people that might not know that that is something that they can do and something that they can, you know, access. Especially the fact that you have to be over 18 to get it means that a lot of people, particularly young trans people, can't access that yet, which means that they can't be legally recognized in the gender that they are until they're 18. So there's a lot of like waiting around and thinking about how much time that takes, and how, you know, young people actually probably need that a lot quicker than, you know, to change things like their birth certificate and stuff like that. I wanted to touch on identity a little bit because there are a few things around kind of identity that it's worth thinking about. So we think about, when we talk about trans people, when we talk about LGBT people, we talk about like sex assigned at birth, which is what is decided at birth. It's based on your external characteristics and your genitalia. You're born, someone will look at you, decide that you're male or female, and then that's that. You kind of have to live in society that kind of genders everything. You see like lots of like different colors for babies, pink for girls, blue for boys, then toys and TV programs, interests, hobbies, etc. Society really kind of lays it on thick when they're kind of gendering stuff. So your sex assigned at birth is kind of decided by someone else, and then usually the doctor, and then you're kind of expected to live this kind of like life based on that gender. Your gender identity, however, is your innate sense of your own gender. So it might not correspond to that sex assigned at birth that you were given when you were a baby. It might be the same, which means you're cisgender. It might be different, which means and can mean that you're transgender. It's very important, I think, to recognize that everybody has a gender identity, regardless of like who you are. It's also important to recognize that everyone has emotional, romantic, and sexual attraction to other people. So if you kind of think about the fact that, you know, a cisgender heterosexual person has a gender identity and a sexual attraction to other people, it might also mean that people don't have sexual, romantic, emotional attraction to people. That's a different kind of thing, which is ACE identities. I'll send you a list of like lots of different words and terminology and stuff for general kind of like LGBT communities. But yeah, everybody kind of has these things. So everybody has a sex assigned at birth, everybody has a gender identity, everyone has your, you know, romantic, sexual, emotional attraction, but also everyone has a different gender expression, right? And I think gender expression is where it kind of gets a bit sticky and a bit nuanced, because it's how a person expresses their gender, right? And that is usually within the context of society's expectations of like your sex assigned at birth. So people will expect women to wear dresses and wear heels and like wear makeup and be feminine. People expect men to wear shirts and trousers and not wear makeup and have short hair and all those kind of things. But actually what happens with humans is they express themselves in loads of different ways. So even if you're heterosexual, cisgender, you still might not have a gender expression that kind of meets with society's expectations of that gender. So you can, if you think about that and think about how difficult it is sometimes for, say, women when you're not kind of dressed as feminine as you could be, you're thinking about kind of how people see you and how they like, if you're wearing a suit, for example, people might see you as more masculine or whatever. But if you're a trans woman, that's going to be that's a lot more difficult because people expect you to be kind of as feminine as possible, but not too feminine. And there's all these kind of rules around gender expression and who can wear what and who can act however they act and things like that. So I think when you're thinking about kind of different people's identities, and particularly with young people, like how they're expressing their gender through their clothing or through the things that they're wearing or how they're wearing their hair, etc. Everything's kind of a big experiment when you're a teenager anyway, and that's even more difficult if you're trans or LGBT. So I think when you're thinking about kind of people's identity, it's good to think about all these things in relation to yourself, in relation to general society's expectations. To put some words under these, sex assigned at birth, male, female, intersex, it's estimated that about 1 in 1,500 people are intersex. There's a really good organisation actually called Intersex UK, which I'm just going to type in the chat so you can see, but they do a lot of work around intersex identities and thinking about like policy and how people are protected by government policy and all those kind of things, and like healthcare for intersex people and things. Gender identity, you've got things like male, female, a trans man, trans woman, non-binary, emotional, romantic, sexual orientation, you've got your lesbian, gay, straight, bi, pan, queer. Any questions on any of these as we go, please feel free to drop them in. And then gender expression, like I said before, you've got kind of like masculine, feminine, and then you've got androgynous, and somewhere in the middle of that. I think there's a real myth sometimes that, like, particularly for like trans and non-binary people, like if a trans man has to be like as masculine as possible, trans women have to be as feminine as possible, but not too feminine or not too masculine. Like there's loads of like kind of rules around it, and like society really kind of expects different things from different people. There's also a really weird myth that like non-binary people are somewhere bang in the middle of that and just dress androgynously all the time. Actually, that's not particularly true. Like non-binary people can sort of dress masculine or feminine, can have beards, can wear makeup, and really kind of play with that gender expression and in terms of their own gender identity as well. So yeah, I think when you're thinking about how to support people and how to, allow people the room that they need and the space that they need in the settings that you're in to express themselves and be themselves, you really have to think about kind of how people are expressing their gender and their gender identity through, what they look like and how they are. To touch on sort of like a little bit of trans history, obviously I have said at the very beginning of this that trans people have always existed. I wanted to introduce you to 3 people. You may already know Elliot Page. That's not actually history because it's very, very current, but I wanted to start with Marsha P Johnson, who I feel like a lot of people know, but basically is an African-American transgender activist and pioneer. A lot of people say that she was there at the Stonewall riots and threw the first brick and all this kind of thing. She was a huge activist for gay liberation, for trans liberation in America, in New York, and was really kind of is very much held up as kind of one of the first people to work in activist spaces and think about how liberation for trans people is incredibly important. You've then got April Ashley, who's an English model, an actress, an author. She was actually outed as trans by the Sunday People, so was very, very publicly outed. She wasn't out when she first started in her career. And I'll touch on another thing about April Ashley in the next couple of slides. Everybody know Elliot Page? feel like there's a lot of nodding happening. Elliot Page is a Canadian actor. He's currently in the Umbrella Academy. They've just filmed series 3, but Elliot came out as trans a few years ago, just as they'd wrapped up sort of filming season 2. So what the Umbrella Academy have done and the Netflix production company have done is actually make, it got announced yesterday that they've actually made his character come out as trans. So the next season, his character will also come out as trans, and it's kind of a huge thing for TV and media, in that like the way that they did that was working with Elliot and working with other trans people to think about and talk about like what trans people want to see and like what the actor actually wants to do with the character. So interesting like change of pace, I think, for sort of film and TV. Having an actual trans actor playing a trans person is quite new and doesn't happen all that often. You'll see a lot of films and things like that where there's a lot of kind of like straight cisgender actors playing trans people. Yeah, I've also got, there's a list at the end of the session actually of like other TV and films. Disclosure, Rebecca's just put in the chat, is also really good. So if you want anything to watch over the weekend, that could very much be your action. Yeah, so to touch on some of the stuff around gender recognition, it's very important, I think, to say that like before 1971, trans people actually did have access to gender recognition. There's a person called Ewan Forbes who changed the sex on his birth certificate in the 40s, and then he announced his new name in the paper, which was very extra of him, and then basically legally married his wife as a man. His cousin then challenged the change because of inheritance reasons. She obviously didn't want him, like at that time, men inherited things and etc. But the judge actually ended up ruling in his favor, and that was, you know, kind of just the done thing. Then in 1971, April Ashley, who we talked about earlier, her husband basically had their marriage annulled because he claimed that she was a man based on the fact that she was trans, and the judge ruled in his favor, which was a huge thing for trans people back then. So in 1971, then it meant that basically trans people were left without access to gender recognition. So no one could, like, it couldn't self-determine, like no one could kind of change their birth certificate without couldn't change it at all. But then in 2004, the Gender Recognition Act was introduced, which basically allows trans people to then apply for a gender recognition certificate, which allows you to change your birth certificate. So before 1971, this was all something that people could just do quite easily, quite quickly, not really have to think about too much. But yeah, up until kind of 1971. Now it means that the process is quite long, it's got quite bureaucratic, it's quite costly. You have to have been living in your gender for 2 years or more. You also have to have a gender dysphoria. So someone has to say that you have gender dysphoria as a diagnosis under the Mental Health Act, which is wild to think that, you know, someone's innate sort of sense of their own gender is classed as a mental health condition. Your application for that costs money. They've just reduced the cost actually, so I'm not sure what the cost is now, but it used to be very expensive. Your application is then seen by a panel of people, up to 4 people who do not know you and have never met you and haven't actually had a conversation with you. If they decide that you are not trans enough to get a gender recognition certificate, they say no, and there is no way of you kind of challenging that. So you just have to start again with the whole thing, which then means you have to have been living in your gender for another 2 years. You have to get another diagnosis of gender dysphoria. You have to pay again. And it's just a really long process. You don't actually need a gender recognition certificate to change anything other than your passport. Although it does mean that, you know, if you're getting married or something like that, there's lots of kind of knock-on effects of not having your correct gender on your birth certificate, like if you have kids or if you're getting married and all those kind of things. There's lots of knock-on effects of that, but it just means that a lot of trans people don't actually access that. and don't have access to that and don't bother with it, which is actually, you know, I think 64%, I think it is, maybe 64% of trans people have said that they would get one if they could, but they just don't feel able to. The kind of the length of time it takes is just too long, and things like that. So just wanted to pick up on that, because a lot of that kind of stuff is interesting, because it's not actually available to anyone under 18. So if you're a trans young person, then you can't access this sort of like gender recognition certificate at all. You can change your gender markers elsewhere. You can change it on your kind of driving license, your passport, etc. The only place you can't change it is your birth certificate. But then obviously it makes other things quite difficult for people. To move into kind of thinking about that and how it affects people's lives generally, I wanted to pick up on some trans experiences. So like, particularly around young people, LGBT students are twice as likely to have been bullied. 91% of them have heard negative language about being LGBTQ in the last year. This is from Just Like Us, who did a research project at the beginning of this year. So this is very, very recent. It's not trans specific, but I think very important to think about like how young people hear language in different schools and different education settings and colleges and all those kind of things, and youth groups, and how actually like it has such a negative impact on people, even if they're not LGBT, right? Like you're hearing negative language around being LGBT generally, you're more likely to be bullied and things like that. It's not a very nice environment for people, especially if they can't be out at home. For a lot of people, particularly young people that I've worked with and continue to work with, like being in a youth work environment or being in an education setting is often the only place where people will come out or feel safe to come out sometimes. So yeah, I think it's important to think about like language and things like that in those settings. 41% of trans people and 31% of non-binary people have experienced a hate crime or incident because of their gender identity in the last 12 months. Any reflections in the chat about any of these stats would be really great to see. But interestingly, that stat is actually from 2 years ago, and it's estimated that those have actually doubled, particularly for trans people. There was a research project by Transactual, I think it was, that basically said that most trans people at the moment have experienced a hate crime or incident because of their gender identity. So it was 41% a few years ago, but due to kind of the recent, I guess, media have, you know, the coverage of trans people and the negative coverage of trans people across the media, and especially on sort of like Twitter and things like that, actually people have seen that has gone up quite a lot. 48% of trans people don't feel comfortable using public toilets through fear of discrimination and harassment. So interesting to think about like how trans people use services, yes, and how they access education and all those kind of things, but also something as simple as using a public toilet. Like that can be a very, very stressful and uncomfortable thing for a lot of trans people. I think even for someone like me who is kind of non-binary and uses their pronouns quite a lot and, you know, has quite a masculine gender expression a lot of the time, like that's quite uncomfortable for me. So for other trans people and for people, especially for trans women, like that can be a really uncomfortable experience, and worth talking about kind of what a lot of my trans friends describe as the trans bladder, which basically a lot of trans people and trans community, they're more likely to have sort of things wrong with their kidneys and get UTIs quite often and all that kind of thing. There's quite a high percentage of people that suffer with things like that in the trans community, on account of not being comfortable using public toilets and not using public toilets when they're out and about, or like not drinking enough, making sure that they're waiting to use the toilet until they get home and things like that. Yeah, and Becca's just popped in the chat, it really doesn't help when the Prime Minister cracks jokes at the expense of trans people. Yeah, that's not a very nice thing to see. I mean, a lot of people will have seen the news yesterday as well of a Conservative MP who came out as trans very recently, off the back of kind of the Prime Minister's jokes at the dinner party. That kind of happened as well. So there's lots of kind of different things going on in the press at the minute around trans people. You see quite a lot of very, very famous people that aren't supportive of trans rights and aren't supportive of trans people. And, you know, a lot of people have quite a big platform that think that way. And you can see why lots of trans people have experienced hate crimes, or might not feel comfortable using toilets, or might not feel comfortable, like, you know, navigating the world generally, or even logging onto Twitter a lot of the time. To pick up on a bit of education ones as well, 40% of students in higher education have experienced negative comments or behaviour from staff in the last year. So not necessarily from other students, but from staff in sort of higher education settings as well. So definitely something that has this kind of the way that trans people are talked about and the way that we're misrepresented a lot of the time in the media kind of leads on to a lot of these things, discrimination, harassment, not feeling comfortable, experiencing being othered in like university settings and education settings, etc. It kind of makes it okay, right? If the Prime Minister's cracking jokes at the expense of trans people, it means it's okay for everyone else to do it, and that's not, and it's not, basically. But yeah, again, like 41% of trans people said healthcare staff lacked the understanding of specific trans health needs whilst accessing general healthcare services. I've got quite a lot of friends who are trans men that still need to get things like smear tests and stuff like that, and it makes it very difficult when, you know, people don't have an understanding of trans people in those settings. There's not a lot of money in the NHS, and there's not a lot of help for the people that actually work in those services to be able to make them as trans inclusive or as LGBT inclusive as they can, which again is another failing of the government, I suppose. But yeah, pupils in schools, it's not all bad news, I guess. Pupils in schools that have positive messaging about LGBT less likely to experience suicidal thoughts and feelings. They're more likely to have better well-being and mental health. So actually thinking about like your messaging and how you speak about people generally, and like how you engage with communities and things like that is really important. There's also a study by the Trevor Project, who are actually based in America, but they did a study around pronouns and young people, and they found that having pronouns respected reduces the amount of suicide attempts for trans people by half. So it is incredibly important to, it's important to get people's pronouns right and to make an effort to make sure that you're getting that right, but it's also very, very important to think about like challenging other people when they're getting them wrong and things like that. Yeah, it sounds like a really simple thing, but just respecting people's pronouns is like, especially for young people, is really, really important. Any reflections on any of these stats or any of the things that we've talked through? Feel free to unmute your mic if you want to do that instead. Trans bladder, yeah, it's a bad one. There's also a thing called the spousal veto, which if you're married and you want to transition, your spouse can veto your transition, your gender recognition certificate application, on the basis that marriage is a contract between a man and a woman. So if you break that contract, your spouse can veto your gender recognition certificate application. So yeah, there's a lot, like I said, there's just a lot of knock-on effects of, the removal of the spousal veto would be really great, because a lot of trans people, particularly if they're married or like, you have to then go through a divorce to be able to transition and use that, get that gender recognition certificate. So yeah, there's lots of different quite shocking things in legislation that definitely need changing. I'm going to do a couple of case studies for the last 10 minutes. So I was going to put you in breakout rooms for this, but I think actually it might be more useful to just have the chat box going. And if anybody wants to pitch in with their mics off, that would be great. So case study 1, you're a teacher at college. One of your students, Davy, is 16 and has recently started using a they, them pronoun badge on their jacket. You hear fellow teachers talking about Davy and referring to them as he, him. You also notice that their pronouns and gender on their student pass say he, him. Are there any things that you could do to support Davy in this scenario?
Ask them what their preferred pronouns are.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm assuming Davy hasn't told you, but has started using a pronoun badge.
Yeah, I think I would have a conversation with them, sort of, you know, get a sense of where they are and, you know, if they, you know, want to make it known to other people, for example. And then, for example, like their student pass, maybe get that updated, have a conversation with other teachers as well, and yeah, sort of take it from there, really.
Yeah, that's a really good one. A couple of people have put similar things in the chat as well, around kind of introducing pronouns into the classroom. What's interesting there as well is like, you could put your pronouns, or you could start wearing a pronoun badge as well. There's like a few different things that you could do, kind of just to have that solidarity. Yep. And then Fran has just put gently correct other teachers and see if we can get their pass changed if they want.
I mean, just to say, if I may, I mean, probably one of the other things that we can do is be able to look at changing policy. There's so much policy in organizations which have been created from a position of privilege that need to be deconstructed. So it's being able to kind of have that conversation to be able to make those changes, because otherwise that particular forum is never safe, and there's so much work that needs to be done with you know, in terms of working with policy, all these kind of things.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I feel like particularly in like where people are accessing services or like education settings and things like that, there's just so much like policy and paperwork and things to fill in, and like stuff that isn't necessarily that useful to people, particularly when, you know, if your sort of gender is more fluid or things like that, or you like, there isn't necessarily a space to write down that you use they, them pronouns, or whatever pronouns you use in places, particularly, you know, when you're like applying for college or you're applying for a place on a program or a project or whatever. But yeah, you're right. I think it's about like trying to deconstruct some of those things and just go back on yourself to make sure that from the very beginning, someone is able to change things themselves. You know, if students have a login to be able to change their profile and things like that, can they change their gender markers, and can they change their pronouns on that whenever they want, or if they want to? It's interesting, like particularly with like using they, them pronouns and non-binary identities and stuff like that, like you might want to change them at different points in your life and in different spaces. So being flexible with that and like giving people kind of the space to be able to do that. But in this situation, like everybody, like a few people have put in the chat, but like talking to Davy is really important, like ensuring that Davy's like, yeah, like Becky's just said, like mention to them that you've noticed that they're using pronouns, and ask them what support they need. They might not want to change their gender marker on their student pass because they might be taking that badge off on their way home. They might not be using them pronouns in different situations and stuff like that. So yeah, definitely like having conversations with Davy, but also gently kind of challenging those teachers on the other teachers on using the correct pronouns for Davy based on the badge. Yeah, great. I'm going to move on to the second one, which is a little bit longer. But so you've started volunteering at an organisation that helps young women get into the music industry and work towards an industry that has a better gender balance. The organisation basically runs DJ and production workshops and allows people to shadow people that are currently working in recording studios. Kaz is a young person that you work with. They've recently come out as trans and has started using he, him pronouns, but only in your workshops. They've told you that they're worried about taking the opportunities and carrying on with the workshops because they don't know if they're allowed to continue because the workshops are technically for girls. What kind of things can you do to support Kaz in this situation? If anyone wants to unmute, they can. I love this because I can see people typing things and writing things down, but then no one's saying out. What's the first thing that you would do, I guess, if you were in this situation? Reassure them. Yeah, great. First thing 6 is pretty dreadful, and that I would immediately think about checking the organization's policy. Yeah, exactly. Does the organization have a policy that backs up what you're going to say though? I think you're right, Becky. Like, it doesn't put the young person first, but you do need to know if the organization has a policy around it. But that reassurance is really important, right? Like, the importance that, like, obviously this is a volunteer organization. So the people that are coming to you are probably people that don't have access to things like this in their kind of general education settings or their life generally. So actually this is probably quite an important thing for Kaz to be able to access. But then that reassurance that this is actually still for you is really important. If the organisation doesn't have a policy or hasn't had to deal with something like this before, then it's worth thinking about how you can make a policy or ensure that there is a process of support there. Yeah, and Laura's right, like, if the organisation therefore needs to change its language in how it promotes the things that it does, like, yes, it's working towards a music industry with a better gender balance, but does that necessarily mean women? And what do you, like, what words can you use? Like, examples in the chat would be great. Like, what could you use instead of women? Yeah, exactly. And also, yeah, Liz is just put in the chat, like, if he only uses them in your workshop, like, you can check that he's happy for you to have further discussions with other people, because it seems like Kaz feels comfortable with you and in your workshop, but actually, like, why is he not using, you know, the pronouns that he wants to use and telling other people as well? Yeah, and Jenny's just popped in there, like, why are they worried that they wouldn't be welcome? Like, has someone said something, or is it just that it's not obvious through the organization's kind of communications or things like that? So there's quite a lot of things to consider in this, right? Like, firstly, kind of how the organization communicates who it's for and what the audience is, but also kind of ensuring that people feel able to access the services that this organization provides. And then there's all the boring stuff like the HR, the policy, all that kind of safeguarding stuff as well. So yeah, this is great. Keeping an eye on the time, I want you to sort of think about these two examples of people, and have a think about kind of like visibility and how it makes such a massive difference. So a lot of the things that you've talked about, particularly in the last one around like communications and like how people feel able to access your spaces or access the things that you're doing, like Thinking about stuff like lanyards and badges is really important. Like making sure that you've got kind of visibility around like having someone that people know that they can go to around trans issues and LGBT issues. Putting your pronouns in your email signatures is like something very, very basic that everyone can do. See a lot of pronouns in email signatures now, more so than ever before. You can also put in your Zoom name, you can add it to your LinkedIn, you can add it to your Twitter, your Instagram, all those things. Like most platforms now have space for you to be able to do that, regardless of whether or not you're trans. Working with trans organizations and fundraising for local charities, again, like such a super important thing, like thinking about like trans organizations that you can bring in. There are some really specific kind of groups of people, particularly working in music at grassroots levels around like trans inclusion and LGBT inclusion. There's like a few organizations who are like groups of trans people that do production, tour production, all those kind of things, and try to bring networks of trans and young people together. I'll send you some links to some people who you can kind of look up after this, but also fundraising for local charities and like thinking about the events that you do maybe, or like the projects that you run. How can you incorporate, you know, raising some money for a local charity or raising some money for a bigger charity, Mermaids or Stonewall or like Transactual or any of those people. Bringing trans people into your work. Like visibility is really important for young people, obviously. Like there's that whole thing of like you can't be what you can't see, but bringing, you know, trans and gender diverse people into your organization to work with your young people, to talk about different issues with them and things like that is really important. And challenging transphobia when you see it. A few people put in the chat about on the last case study around kind of like challenging the other people that aren't getting people's pronouns right, or, you know, are holding up or retweeting things that might be like transphobic, etc. It can be difficult to kind of challenge transphobia. It can be like difficult, especially if you're not necessarily, if you're not trans, if you don't have like a understanding of what the issues are and things like that, but actually just kind of being like, it's not all right to do that, mate. And challenging in a very gentle way is quite nice sometimes. I also heard a kind of a way of doing that around tone matching, which like basically if like someone is talking about something in a transphobic, homophobic way, like matching that person's tone of kind of like, well, actually, this is like, without getting into an argument, obviously, but thinking about like how to kind of challenge someone by asking them questions and questioning what they're saying rather than kind of challenging in a argumentative way. But it can bring people's kind of thoughts, like bring people on board a little bit more with kind of how they're talking about different communities and different people. Celebrating things like Trans Day visibility. There's loads of different markers in the diary for different parts of the LGBT community. So thinking beyond like Pride and Pride Month and things like that. There's Trans Day of Remembrance, Trans Day visibility, Trans Awareness Week, like lots of different things that you can do around that. And you can feed some of that into kind of working with trans organizations and fundraising and things like that. Doing the internal work might sound boring and sometimes can be a little bit, you know, we make it when we need it kind of thing. But it's good to have inclusive policies and different routes to reporting and like thinking about your safeguarding and making that trans inclusive and all those kind of things, like looking through like the language used in different policies and stuff like that. And signage in your buildings. Things like having at least one gender neutral toilet option is really important if you can. Making sure that, you know, people can see things around Trans Visibility Day, they can see things around like, these are the values that we have as an organisation. We want you to kind of, when you're in this building, we want you to adhere to these values and be aligned with our values as an organisation, etc. Can be like super important. I think just comms in general around language and things like that is really important too. So thinking about like your social media and all that kind of stuff is also really important. Some tips there, but I want you to spend sort of like the last 5 minutes or so just thinking about your specific job. what kind of influence and control that you have to help create a more inclusive environment within your job role for trans people. So it might just be something very small that you can do today. It might be, you know, popping your email signature pronouns in, or ordering a load of badges, or like to give out to students and like give out to the young people that you work with. It might be something more like office-based, like lanyards and things like that. Then something that you can kind of think about changing over the next few months, and feel free to take these kind of questions away to think about, and something you might need help with, and the other people within your organization or networks that might be able to help you with some of this stuff. So the last thing might be something huge, might be something completely different. It might be just setting up a program of support specifically for trans young people, or, you know, changing an application process or a recruitment process or things like that. And something you can change that you might need help with, because we can't do all these things on our own. You know, there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that trans people feel included across society. You can see from, you know, the current media storms and the current kind of climate for trans people that it's a very difficult like world to exist in as a trans person. So actually changing some small things in your organization will go a long way to ensuring people have that kind of safety of place where they can be themselves, which is really important. Feel free to share some of these in the chat or with each other as well, especially the stuff that you can do today, because yeah, we can all finish the call and then do something right now this afternoon.